Hi, everyone. My name is Daniil Gataulin. I'm one of the senior research analysts covering biotech here at Chardon, where our vision is to help identify companies with high potential for investment returns based on creating real value for society through disruptive innovation. It is my pleasure to introduce Megan Baldwin, the CEO, and Tim Morris, the CFO of Opthea, to our virtual ophthalmology summit. Megan, Tim, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, so to start things off, can you please provide a brief overview of Opthea and perhaps mention some of the recent milestones?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for allowing us to participate in the summit. We are Opthea Limited. We are a dual listed company, listed on the ASX as well as on the NASDAQ. We are developing a novel treatment for wet age-related macular degeneration, which we call OPT302. It's an intravitreal injection into the eye for use in combination with anti-VEGF-A treatments. Right now, we're in phase 3 clinical development with OPT302, conducting global phase 3 registrational studies called SHORE and COAST. We are effectively a agent that targets novel members of the VEGF family, namely VEGF-C and D, and when used in combination with treatments such as Lucentis or Eylea, we have demonstrated in previous phase 2 randomized controlled clinical trials a superior gain in visual acuity benefit for patients. So we're very excited about the asset. We can achieve a broader blockade of the VEGF pathway, which translates into improved vision outcomes. And we're really differentiated from a lot of the other development programs in the wet AMD space through our novel approach. We anticipate progressing the phase 3 clinical trials, which are currently recruiting patients, and anticipate reporting out top-line data from that phase 3 clinical program early in first quarter of 2025 calendar year. And so we're very pleased to have this novel asset, and we're the most advanced asset currently in clinical development that may actually address the unmet medical need for this highly prevalent and very large commercial opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview. Very helpful. So as you mentioned, OPT302 targets VEGF-C and D. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is unique about those targets, and perhaps provide a mechanistic rationale for targeting C and D in addition to VEGF-A or B that are targets of the other approved therapies?
Yeah, so there's really only one class of agents that's approved for the treatment of wet AMD, and they all essentially work in the same with the same mechanism of action. That is that they target VEGF-A. VEGF-A is a key driver in the development of wet AMD because it stimulates blood vessel growth as well as vascular leakage by binding and activation of VEGF receptor 2 in the VEGF receptor pathway. VEGF-C and D are novel members of that pathway, but they do have an overlapping receptor binding activation specificity. So VEGF-C and D in their own right can stimulate blood vessel growth and vascular leakage by binding and activating through the same receptor that VEGF-A binds to. And VEGF-C and D are also the only 9 ligands that activate VEGF receptor 3, which is an independent signaling pathway that can also have an impact on the disease progression as well. So by targeting VEGF-C and D with OPT302, which is a trap molecule, which sequesters VEGF-C and D and prevents receptor interaction, used in combination with any VEGF-A inhibitor, we can achieve a complete blockade of both of those receptor signaling pathways. And the consequence of that is that we have a greater impact on inhibiting vessel growth and lesion development, and we have a greater impact in reducing fluid at the back of the eye in patients that have wet AMD. In addition, we, through OPT302 administration, can actually target an important mechanism that can lead to suboptimal clinical responses in patients. So what we find in patients that receive standard of care treatment with Lucentis or Eylea is that VEGF-A suppression actually drives up a compensatory upregulation of VEGF-C and D. And this can actually contribute to suboptimal responses with drugs like Lucentis or Eylea. By targeting VEGF-C and D, therefore, we can address that mechanism that can lead to suboptimal responses and therefore have a greater impact on visual acuity outcomes for patients. And we've demonstrated that in a large randomized controlled clinical study in the phase 2b setting. And we're doing similar in the outcomes and the approach that we're taking for our phase 3 clinical development program as well.
Got it. And when you say in combination with other approved products, is 302 being administered with others basically during the same session?
Yes, we anticipate that patients, and currently in our phase 3 clinical trials, that's exactly how it's working. Patients come in for their routine clinical visit, and at the same clinical visit, they receive the standard of care treatment. In one trial, that's Lucentis. In the other trial, that is Eylea. And in that same clinical visit, they receive a second injection with OPT-302. That second injection occurs within a matter of minutes. There is a simple procedure just to look at intraocular pressure and ensure that that's come down to within a normal range. And we haven't seen any concerns around intraocular pressure elevations with the administration. And then they receive a second injection with our therapy. So it is a drug that actually fits seamlessly into the clinic and into the normal patient-physician treatment paradigm that we see in retinal clinics around the US and other parts of the world as well.
Got it. And to, I guess, to dig just a little bit deeper on the intraocular pressure, so how much volume are you injecting with each injection? And after the 302 injection, how long does it take for the intraocular pressure to normalize?
Yeah, so we are a product that is a 50 microliter injection. That's the same volume of administration as Lucentis, Eylea, the other standard products that are already approved for the treatment of the disease. So that's just a 50 microliter injection on top of their first injection that's also 50 microliters. So it's a very well tolerated volume. And we do know that that's actually well tolerated. There are several therapies that are either approved or used routinely in the clinic that are 100 microliters even in a single injection. So the second injection of 50 microliters is very well tolerated by patients, and that's consistent with what we're observing in our clinical trials and our clinical experience with the molecule to date. When we look at the intraocular pressure measures, which we are required to do as part of our clinical trial protocol, we find that intraocular pressure normalizes within a matter of minutes in the vast majority of patients, and really haven't seen any clinical sequelae or any concerns around the volume of injection at all.
Got it. That's good to hear. And based on the mechanism, on the additive mechanism, I guess, of including CND targeting, how much additional benefit can patients expect, and how meaningful is it for them as well as for eye care practitioners? Yeah,
so we've observed across all of the wet AMD patients that we've recruited into our clinical trial a 3.4 letter gain across the total patient population. And in patients that actually have minimal classic or occult lesions, which indeed is the most common form of wet AMD, we see over 5.5 letters of gain of visual acuity in those patients. So that's over a line gain of visual acuity benefit in the vast majority of patients when OPT-302 is added on top of standard of care treatment. And that really speaks to our mechanism being additive, and having a broader blockade of that pathway that leads to the disease progression is having a very compelling and impactful outcome on the visual acuity of those patients. We're confident that that is a clinically meaningful improvement in vision, and that's why we've moved forward with our phase 3 clinical program.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk about those clinical results. So you've completed 2 studies already, phase 1 and phase 2. You have 2 ongoing phase 3 studies. First, maybe if you could spend a few minutes and give us an overview of the completed studies and the maybe high level of the results that you saw to date.
Yeah, sure. So in the wet AMD setting, we've completed a 51 patient phase 1/2 clinical trial. I mentioned that clinical trial because it was one where we investigated OPT-302 administered as a monotherapy as well as in combination with ranibizumab or Lucentis treatment. And that was an important study for us because we showed visual acuity improvement even in patients that did not receive standard of care as a background. So it highlighted to us that targeting VEGF-C and D, even in isolation, was leading to visual acuity benefit for patients. And that really did validate our approach by targeting VEGF-C and D for the treatment of wet AMD. In addition to that quite large phase 1/2 study, we were able to dose escalate and showed that there was no safety concerns with the molecule. And we also showed that there was efficacy in both treatment naive as well as patients that had been on longer term treatment with anti-VEGF-A inhibitors. We then used that phase 1 data to inform the design of our phase 2b clinical trial in wet AMD. Our phase 2b clinical trial was one of the largest phase 2b studies conducted in wet AMD. It was in treatment naive patients. We recruited 366 patients. And in that study, patients were randomized to one of 3 treatment groups. The first treatment group just received Lucentis on its own. And then we asked the question, what additional visual acuity benefit do we see in patients if we add OPT-302, firstly, as a low dose to a background ranibizumab treatment, and then in the other arm, administering it at a 2 milligram dose in combination with Lucentis. And what that randomized controlled phase 2b clinical trial showed was if we treat patients on an every 4 weekly basis for 6 months, that the OPT-302 mediated a superior gain in visual acuity benefit for patients over and above what the standard of care alone provided patients. And as I said earlier, that was about a 3.4 letter gain in visual acuity over and above standard of care across the total patient population, and about a 5.7 letter gain over and above the standard of care in the what we call the high responding patients. Those patients that have minimally classic and occult lesions, they did very, very well on our treatment. And what that taught us actually, and what we learned from that clinical trial, is that the minimally classic and the occult lesions tend to respond less well to standard of care treatment, but they are indeed the patients that stand to gain the most benefit from OPT-302. And that's where we saw the greatest efficacy of our clinical therapeutic candidate. So we are very excited about showing a greater than a line gain of visual acuity in our patients. The functional endpoint of visual acuity was consistent across various parameters that we measured. The primary endpoint was mean change in best-corrected visual acuity, but several other visual outcomes, including the proportion of patients that gained 15 letters, 10 letters, and 5 letters, were also very much improved in the combination treatment group compared to the control. Then we stepped down, we also looked at our secondary outcomes, and the secondary outcomes span things like anatomical benefit. So we saw a greater reduction in retinal thickness when OPT-302 was administered to patients. We also saw a greater drying effect when OPT-302 was administered as well. One of the very important measures, I think, is the reduction of disease burden in patients. That is, when we measured the area of the wet AMD lesions, we were able to show almost a 40% relative improvement in the degree of regression of wet AMD lesion size when OPT-302 was administered to patients. So the greater inhibition that's brought about by OPT-302 when it's used in combination with standard of care treatment consistently across the primary endpoints of visual acuity, as well as the secondary anatomical endpoints of reducing fluid, greater drying of the retina, and reducing disease burden, were all consistently better when OPT-302 was administered. And that provides, a lot of consistency in the outcomes of treatments, and in the totality of the data really speaks to, I guess, the therapeutic benefit of OPT-302 administration.
Got it. And I have a question about the phase 2 trial. So you looked at 2 doses there, and one interesting result was for the combination of ranibizumab with the lower dose. The results were numerically slightly worse than for ranibizumab alone, although the high dose outperformed ranibizumab by quite a bit. Do you have a possible mechanistic explanation for the low dose observation?
Yeah, so the lower dose was not statistically different from the control group. So I don't think that although it was numerically lower, I think that's just within the variability of trial outcomes. So I don't think that there was any lower benefit. I think that it was just very similar to the control. And I think that speaks to the fact that 0.5 milligram dose is not the threshold that we require in order to see a functional outcome in visual acuity. We did see some dose responsiveness in some of the secondary outcome measures, such as anatomical changes of retinal dryness, retinal thickness, and the lesion size, but it didn't translate into a dose response in the mean change in best corrected visual acuity. I think that speaks to the limited pharmacokinetic data that you often go into a phase 2. We went in with our phase 1 pharmacokinetic data, and that's a limited data set because our drug is ideally suited for administration into the eye. It has a very good biodistribution and pharmacokinetic profile. It's a large molecule, so it has a great longevity in the eye or durability in the eye itself. But once it gets into the systemic circulation, it's very rapidly cleared. And so that's really great for minimizing systemic exposure of a drug when you really need to only target retinal tissue at the back of the eye. But what it does mean is that we had limited pharmacokinetic outcomes that informed the selection of the dose into our phase 2. Also, I think that we may have underestimated actually the degree of upregulation that can occur in patients that receive a VEGF-A inhibitor. So VEGF-C and D levels may actually have been more elevated in the patients that actually received the ranibizumab in the clinical trial, which would account for that 0.5 milligram dose not quite being high enough to produce a dose response for a visual acuity outcome.
Got it. And I understand, the gains that you saw in those trials are considered clinically significant. Have you had any patient feedback that you could share or any clinician feedback?
Certainly a lot of clinician feedback. And we spend a lot of time either doing research or just liaising and seeking feedback from key opinion leaders and the investigators who are involved in our studies all around the world. And actually our physicians have very consistent feedback around their enthusiasm for wanting to have new drugs to offer their patients right now, and for many years have really been restricted in only being able to offer a VEGF-A inhibitor. So there's very little optionality for them to give their patients the opportunity to have better visual acuity outcomes over and above standard of care. So I think generally speaking, physicians want the best clinical outcome for patients, and they recognise the need for new therapies that actually target novel mechanisms in order to address that. So I think that they're very excited about having a potential new drug that they can offer patients. I also think that they're particularly impressed with the safety profile of our therapy. We haven't seen any safety concerns with the drug, and we've now treated thousands of patients with the drug. Of course, we continue to monitor safety, but the data that we have to date would indicate that we're not exacerbating intraocular pressure, we're not exacerbating intraocular inflammation, and it's a very well tolerated and clean approach as a therapeutic. So there's that confidence that administering OPT-302 on top of any standard of care is actually well tolerated, but also has the potential to provide clinical outcomes for patients. And they often point to our phase 2 clinical study and say, look, you guys are the only company, the only drug in development that actually may offer additional clinical benefit. You're working in a landscape where the majority of companies are actually only seeking to improve durability of VEGF-A inhibitors. You guys are doing something different. You're doing something unique, something novel, targeting a different part of a validated pathway that we expect to provide real clinically meaningful benefit. And in that regard, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for our approach.
Got it. That's good to hear. And I think we can move on to the phase 3 program now. Maybe if you could walk us through the trial designs first, and then we can dive a little bit deeper.
Sure. We're conducting 2 concurrent, large phase 3 randomized controlled registrational studies. The first of our clinical trials is the SHORE study. So this is the study of OPT-302 in combination with ranibizumab or Lucentis. And the second clinical trial is the combination of OPT-302 with Eylea or aflibercept, which we call our COAST study. They're both being conducted in around 30 countries worldwide. We anticipate recruiting 990 patients, all of which are treatment-naive patients per clinical study. So overall, in totality, almost 2,000 patients will be enrolled in this program. The design of the SHORE and the COAST clinical trials are very, very similar. They just are in combination with a different standard of care. So in each of the clinical trials, we will look at the efficacy benefit or the impact of visual acuity when we add OPT-302 either to Lucentis treatment in the SHORE study or to Eylea treatment in the COAST study, and ask the question, after 12 months of treatment, do we see a superior gain in visual acuity in the combination treatment arm compared to the arm that receives just the standard of care alone? Now, we will, in each of the studies, they're 3-arm studies, and we will be combining OPT-302 on an every 4-week dosing regimen with the standard of care in one arm, and on an every 8-week dosing regimen in combination with the standard of care in the other arm. So we're going to get information around efficacy benefit, but we're also going to get information around how well our drug works on different dosing regimens every 4 and every 8 weeks.
Got it. So as you mentioned, the COAST trial is looking at the combination of OPT-302 with the aflibercept, which I don't believe you looked at in the earlier trials in wet AMD, correct?
Not in wet AMD, but we did go into the phase 3, having completed a phase 2A clinical trial in diabetic macular edema patients. And that was a phase 2A study of over 150 patients where we recruited patients that had had previous exposure to an anti-VEGF-A treatment and had not responded very well, and they had persistent edema and were continuing to suffer from diabetic macular edema in that patient population. Now, in that phase 2A study, we actually combined OPT-302 with Eylea in that study. That was a very important study because it showed that we could have an efficacy benefit on top of Eylea in diabetic macular edema patients, albeit it was a complex study because the patients that we were recruiting into that trial were previously exposed and heavily refractory to anti-VEGF-A therapy. But in combining with Eylea, we were able to show that there was an additional clinical benefit by adding OPT-302 to Eylea treatment. It was also important as a supportive trial for our phase 3 initiation because we were able to establish a safe and well-tolerated safety profile when we combined OPT-302 with Eylea. Because you're correct, our wet AMD studies to date at that time had only been conducted with Lucentis. So the DME study was very important for us establishing safety and an efficacy profile in combination with Eylea. And that then enabled us to seamlessly transition into the phase 3 clinical program and move directly into the phase 3 without requiring a dose escalation with an Eylea background standard of care.
Got it. And to clarify, based on the mechanism or similar mechanisms of aflibercept and ranibizumab, do you expect to see any difference at all in the phase 3 between those two?
Look, the way we've designed the studies, the reason we've kept both of the clinical trials separate, one with Lucentis in the SHORE study and one with Eylea in the COAST study, is that we want it to be a very clean clinical trial. So we see the additive benefit of OPT-302 and VEGF-C/D inhibition as being additive to any anti-VEGF-A treatment. And so we expect that mechanism to be added on top of whatever the standard of care treatment does in each respective study. So we recognise that Eylea is often the preferred choice by many physicians. Whilst there hasn't been any clinical trial that's demonstrated a better clinical efficacy benefit of Eylea versus Lucentis, I guess the clinical experience may suggest that you might get a higher standard of care outcome in the Eylea trial than what you might have in the Lucentis trial. But the additive benefit of OPT-302 we expect would be equally applicable in the Eylea trial compared to the Lucentis trial. So let me give you an example. If in the Lucentis trial, the Lucentis control arm does 9 letters and we were able to provide a 5-letter gain, we would expect the combination treatment arm to do 14 versus 9 letters. And in the EYLEA trial, for example, if EYLEA does 10 letters and we produce a 5-letter gain, the relative benefit is still 5 letters, but it's 10 letters versus 15. And that's because we see the additional benefit is mechanism on top of mechanism, regardless of what the standard of care treatment actually does in each study.
Got it, makes sense. And we see a lot of effort is being put forward to extend the treatment intervals to reduce treatment burden for patients. Do you expect OPT-302 could potentially be a part of that benefit?
Absolutely. And I think the way that we like to think about that is, look, in our phase 3, we are seeking to get approval on a superior outcome in terms of efficacy. However, if our drug works better in combination with an anti-VEGF-A treatment, and we get a higher visual acuity benefit right from the outset in patients, then that additional benefit, that greater clinical efficacy, may indeed allow the efficacy to actually last longer as well. So it may allow patients to actually go longer between the necessity to have another injection. So in that way, I actually think that we have a very real potential impact on durability as well as efficacy. It's not our primary endpoint of the study, but it does speak to greater benefit, lasting longer, and actually being able to stretch out patients longer between injections. Investigating the durability of OPT-302 is something that we're very interested in doing. I see that that is something that we can really dive into in separate clinical studies that would be either running adjacent to or following the top-line data readout of our phase 3 clinical trial. We'll also get additional understanding of the durability of OPT-302 following what we hope is a successful outcome as phase 3, and this drug becomes available to physicians. I fully anticipate that those physicians will use this drug on a treat and extend protocol, and there will be a lot of clinical experience come from those physicians that use our drug to really inform how long it can be extended out. But we would anticipate as a company that we'll also inform that through clinical trial outcomes as well. The other thing that I think is really interesting that we view is the high-dose EYLEA studies that Regeneron's conducted, where a higher concentration and a greater volume of injection that administers more drug into the eye can actually result in greater durability of the product. And we really like that study as a proof of concept for us, actually, because our molecule is not dissimilar in the structure to EYLEA. It does have a different mechanism of action, of course, but the potential for us to also recreate a high-dose form of our drug is something that we could pursue down the line and actually further address durability questions with a high-dose formulation of OPT-302. But right now we're focused on delivery of the phase 3 study as a sequential injection and at 2 milligrams. We've shown great data in phase 2, but all of those additional outcomes around durability are things that I think further add to the value of OPT-302 administration in the long term.
Got it. Okay, and to summarize the phase 3 program, can you tell us where you are in terms of enrollment? And I believe you mentioned that data are expected in the first quarter of 2024.
First quarter of 2025. So what we're doing right now is recruiting patients. Patient recruitment is going very well. We're actually have been recruiting since 2021. So we're very advanced in our patient recruitment. We are aiming to recruit 990 patients per clinical study. And we're very advanced in that patient recruitment. And we expect to be recruiting throughout the end of this calendar year, 2023. Once that last patient comes in, all patients need to receive 12 months of injections, and then we're able to clean the data, database lock, and then report top-line outcomes. And that takes us to top-line data reporting anticipated first quarter of 2025. So what I can say is that we will be updating the market around patient recruitment in due course, but it is very much well advanced.
Got it, makes sense. Okay, and let's jump to the DME program. You talked a little bit about it already. Maybe if you could provide a quick overview of the phase 1b/2a results that you saw there.
Yeah, so as I said, the phase 1b/2a clinical trial was in prior treated patients that had persistent diabetic macular edema despite having received prior anti-VEGF-A treatment. The phase 1b part of that clinical trial was a dose escalation in order to establish safety profile of OPT-302 when it's administered in combination with Eylea. And in that phase 1b clinical study, we actually were able to dose escalate up to 2 milligram dose of OPT-302 with the 2 milligram dose of Eylea. And we didn't see any safety concerns with the molecule. So we were able to move forward into the dose expansion, which was the phase 2a clinical study. The phase 2a clinical study recruited patients that either stayed on Eylea treatment or those patients that received Eylea plus OPT-302. So it was controlled in that way. Now, we did show a 3.4 letter gain in the OPT-302 combination treatment group over and above what the prior treated patients in the standard of care Eylea control group achieved in itself. So again, we showed after only 3 months of treatment in this particular trial that we showed a clinical benefit of visual acuity gains when OPT-302 was added on top of Eylea. So that was, as I said, it was a complex study in the sense of when you conduct studies in prior treated patients, you have to be very careful around what that patient population looks like. And we saw the greatest benefit in the patients that had actually been on prior Eylea therapy, where their VEGF-A suppression had been inhibited quite adequately. Then when we were able to detect the efficacy benefit in OPT-302, because VEGF-A suppression was normalized between the groups between the patients in that group. And then we could clearly see that there was as I said, about a 3.4 letter gain across the patients that had previously received Eylea in that clinical trial that was mediated by adding OPT-302 on top of their treatment. So that was further validation for us that we could see additive benefit of using OPT-302 on top of Eylea, and it was similar, I guess, conceptually to what we'd observed in larger clinical trials conducted in the wet AMD setting in combination with Lucentis. So all of our data across now 2 indications were very supportive of better and superior visual acuity gains when OPT-302 is added. And like I said, the safety profile with Eylea was very well tolerated, and it was very important for us to establish that to move forward with our phase 3 clinical program as well.
Got it. Thank you for that overview. Very helpful. And in terms of the next goals for the DME programs, can you share what your plans are?
Yeah, we think the next steps for the DME program are to conduct a phase 3 clinical trial. Right now, we're very focused on delivering our wet AMD phase 3 clinical program. In all likelihood, we would be pursuing the next step in the phase 3 DME study after the readout of top-line data. That's just a cash and resources question, really, for the company to remain focused on the wet AMD outcomes. But we would like to trigger the DME program sooner rather than later. We do anticipate that the phase 3 program in diabetic macular edema would be a smaller clinical program where we would be able to leverage the outcomes in our wet AMD study. We would go to the FDA as well as other regulatory agencies to determine how large that program would be. It's possible that we only need to do 1 phase 3 clinical trial in diabetic macular edema because we would have a strong data package in wet AMD, for example. And we would be going into that diabetic macular edema study understanding the outcomes in terms of the visual acuity benefit, which would enable us to tailor the design of the DME study as well. So overall, I think it would be a smaller undertaking for DME because it would follow in the footsteps of successful outcomes of our wet AMD program.
Got it. Okay. And I see we're coming up on time, but just a couple of more quick questions. Makes sense that you're managing the resources, so I wanted to follow up on that. If you could comment on the company's cash position and what you expect it to carry the company through.
Yeah, I'll hand to Tim because he's the CFO and he's the guy positioned to speak to that. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. So we reported cash on hand at the end of December. So we're a 6/30 year-end reporting. So we reported cash on hand at the end of December of $142 million. We also, as part of the development funding agreement that the company completed last year with Carlisle and Abingworth, there's another $35 million contractually that will come in by the end of this calendar year. And then there's an option for another $50 million of funding under that agreement as well by the end of the year. As I mentioned, we're going to report our fiscal year end, which is 6/30 guidelines and cash balance here at the end of August, so I won't update anything on that. But we've had a good history of the ability to fund these trials, either creatively through the DFA or through just raising money, mainly in Australia.
Got it. Thank you. And I guess I'll finish with the one last question, a more general question, I guess. What do you think the market is missing about the Opthea story?
Oh, I think as a company with a very large phase 3 clinical program, obviously it takes us some time to get to, anticipated top-line data reporting. And for many years, we've been an ASX-listed company and only recently listed on the NASDAQ. So we're in a process of building our momentum and our awareness amongst global markets in the US. We've always had strong support out of the US in terms of, specialist healthcare investors. But I think that there is, an educational piece more broadly beyond that, around just bringing an awareness to the late stage of our clinical program and how advanced we are, and our point of difference to a lot of the other programs that are developing assets for wet AMD. And so I think it's just an awareness thing, and I think as we anticipate getting closer to phase 3 clinical trial readout, that there will be greater market appreciation and recognition of the true potential of this asset. Tim, do you have any other further comments around that too?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure people fully appreciate the value of the improvement that we get on top of current VEGF-A. I mean, one thing that's always impressed me is, this ability to take people back into a 2040 vision. And that really that's the difference between driving or not driving and cooking for yourself or reading a book. And so I think people look at the potential in wet AMD, think that maybe the existing therapies are good. They do a nice job, but they're really not good enough. And so I think people need to understand what that improvement looks like, and that will be a huge success.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you very much. With that, I think we're at the time. Thank you again for joining us for our ophthalmology summit. I really appreciate having you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to participate. Thank you very much.